Let us imagine you wanted to own a medieval English manor. Go ahead, picture the scene. You're standing in the great hall of your very own house. A fire crackles in the hearth. Servants bow as you walk past. And in your head, you're already spending the fortune that must surely come with all this land. Then the steward hands you the ledger, and the dream starts to wobble, because that ledger is full of numbers going the wrong way. You owe money to the Lord above you. Your peasants owe you their labor. Your mill is falling apart, and harvest season is 90 days away. This is the real economy of knighthood, and it has almost nothing to do with swords and castles. So today we're going to open that ledger and find out what it actually costs to be a knight, what fills your purse, what drains it, and why so many lords ended up poorer than the peasants who work their fields. By the end, you will never look at a medieval village the same way again. First, let us agree on what you actually own, because most people picture a knight living in a fairy tale castle with towers and banners. The truth is far more ordinary. Your manor is not a castle. It is an estate, a working piece of countryside made up of a manor house, a small village, a church, some woods, and a great deal of farmland. And the key to understanding your wealth is that you do not farm all of it yourself. The land is split into two parts. The domain is the portion you keep for yourself, the fields that your own workers till and that send their harvest straight into your granaries. The rest is held by the peasants of the village, who live on the land and work it in exchange for the right to stay there. So on day one, you understand the basic deal of the medieval economy. You do not earn money by doing anything, you earn money by owning the ground other people stand on, and by controlling the rules that govern their work. Now, why do you own this land at all? Because you are a knight, and a knight receives his land, his fief, as payment for a promise, the promise to serve your lord, usually a baron or an earl, with your body and your weapons for about 40 days in a year. This is the deal called knight service, and it is the foundation of the whole feudal world. Land in exchange for loyalty, protection in exchange for service, a knight's fee. The unit of land meant to support one knight is usually a single manor like this one. And the importance of knowing exactly what a manor was worth is so old that in 1086 William the Conqueror ordered a survey of every estate in England, the famous Doomsday Book, because the crown understood that whoever controlled the record of the land controlled the revenue it produced, and that record shows just how ordinary your manor is. In the 13th century, a knight's fee like this might bring in somewhere between 10 and 20 pounds a year. To give you a sense of scale, in 1292 the English crown decided that any man holding land worth 40 pounds a year was rich enough to be forced into knighthood. So a manor giving you 15 pounds put you comfortably in the gentry, but far from the top of the pile, and that is the first shock of your new life. You are not a prince. You are a middle manager of real estate with a title, a sword, and a chronic shortage of ready cash. So now that we know what you own, let's talk about the money that actually comes in, because a medieval manor did not run on a single income. It ran on 5 streams at once, and each one behaves differently. The first and most reliable stream is rent. Your peasants pay to live on and work your land. Some pay in coins, but many pay in kind sacks of grain, eggs, cheese, firewood. And this is not charity or old custom. It is the contract that keeps everyone alive. The second stream is the produce of your own domain, the fields you farm directly. You do not eat all of that harvest, you sell the surplus. And in the 13th century, the market was booming, towns were growing, and bread, wool, and livestock all fetched real money. A knight who managed his domain, well, could turn a solid profit. A knight who managed it badly could watch his best grain rot in the barn. And the most valuable thing a manor could produce was often wool. English wool was the industrial wonder of medieval Europe, shipped across the channel to the cloth workshops of Flanders, and a manor with good pasture could make more from its sheep than from its ploughland. Before we go further, let us get the money straight. Medieval England counted money in pennies, shillings, and pounds, with 12 pennies in a shilling and 20 shillings in a pound. So a pound was 240 pennies, several weeks of a working man's wages, which is why lords so often thought in pounds while peasants thought in pennies. The third stream of income is the one that surprises people. Your monopolies. In most manors, the lord owns the mill, the oven, and the wine or cider press, and no one else is allowed to build their own. So every peasant who wants flour, bread, or ale has to use your equipment and pay you for the privilege. You take a share of their grain as the fee, often a 16th, or a 24th of everything they grind. It sounds small, but when it is every household in the village, every single week, it adds up to a very tidy sum. The fourth stream is your court. Every manor has its own court, and it does real business. It settles disputes over land and boundaries. It collects fines from peasants who break the village rules. And since you're the judge, Those fines flow straight into your pocket. The fifth stream is the market itself. Many lords hold the right to a weekly market or an annual fair, and they collect a toll on every stall and every cart that comes to trade. And here's what those coins could actually buy. In the 13th century, a penny bought a decent loaf of bread, a few pennies fed a working man for a day, and a shilling, 12 pennies, was a respectable sum for a small household. So when a fine of 10 shillings left your court, that represented weeks of a peasant surplus. And when your harvest fetched 40 pounds, that was a small fortune. The gap between the pennies of the village and the pounds of the Lord was the whole point of the system. And the Lord's job was to harvest that gap. So put it all together and the picture changes. A knight is not just a soldier. He's a landlord, a mill owner, a judge, and a tax collector, all at once. And the strange truth is that the most profitable parts of his job had nothing to do with fighting at all. But income is only half the story, because running a manor is expensive and the costs come at you from every direction. The first and biggest is your equipment. Because you promise to serve as a knight, you have to actually look like one, and that means horses, plural. You need a riding horse for everyday travel, a pack horse or cart for your goods, and a warhorse, the destrier, for the battlefield. And here is the price that makes modern people gasp. A proper warhorse in 13th century England could cost 40 to 80 pounds. Remember that your entire manor might earn 15 pounds a good year. So a single good warhorse was worth 3 to 5 years of your whole income. It was the medieval equivalent of buying a house on hooves. A gentle riding horse, a palfrey, might run you 2 or 3 pounds, and a good cart horse for the farm cost 10 to 20 shillings. And then you have the armor on top, a mail hauberk, a helmet, a shield, a sword, and the padding underneath. A full kit could run you another 20 to 40 pounds. So before you ever ride out anywhere, you have sunk several years of income into the clothes on your back. And to give you a sense of everyday prices, a good ox for the plow cost about 13 shillings, a cow half that, a sheep a single shilling or two. A day of unskilled labor brought a penny or two in the early 13th century, while a skilled carpenter or mason could earn 3 or 4 pennies, and a quarter of wheat, enough to bake one person's bread for a year, might cost 5 shillings in a normal year, and 3 times that when the harvest failed. Next come your people. A manor does not run itself. You need a steward or bailiff to manage the fields, a cook, a groom for the horses, a few servants, and a small group of armed men to keep the peace and to ride with you. Every one of these people expects food, clothing, and wages, and they eat a frightening amount. Feeding a household of even 20 people through the winter takes a staggering quantity of grain, meat, and ale. And then there's the manor house itself. Timber, thatch, and stone all wear out, roofs leak, and walls sag. So every few years you are paying for repairs whether you like it or not. Then there's hospitality. In the medieval world, the lord is expected to feed every guest who arrives, and guests arrive often. When your own lord travels through your land, you are expected to host him and his entourage and their horses for as long as they stay. A single such visit could swallow months of profit, and you cannot refuse. It is a duty of your rank. On top of all that, a tenth of your harvest, the tithe, belongs to the church every year, automatically. And finally, the crown and your immediate lord both want their cut. When you inherit the manor, you pay a relief, a fee to take up the land. And when your lord goes to war, you either serve in person or pay scutage, a cash payment in place of your service. All of these are debts you cannot dodge. So if you add it all up, a manor earning 15 pounds a year could easily spend 12 of them on wages, food, repairs, tithes, and dues, leaving only a few pounds of profit. And those few pounds were your entire return on owning a whole village. Which is why so many knights lived in houses that looked grand from the outside, but were short on coin within. The honest summary of medieval lordship is this: you own a great deal, you control a great deal, and yet you're constantly short of cash, because the lifestyle of a knight was engineered to swallow every penny it could reach. Now let us talk about the people who actually make this whole machine run, because without them, your domain is just weeds. Your peasants are not slaves, and they're not your employees in the modern sense. They're tenants with obligations, and the exact mix of those obligations decides everything about your wealth. The most valuable thing a peasant owes you is his labor, on top of their own fields. Most villains, the peasant class tied to the manor, owe you a set number of working days on your domain, often 2 or 3 days a week. plus extra days at the crunch moments, at plowing, at harvest, at sheep shearing. This is called week work and boon work, and it is the beating heart of the manorial economy because it is labor you did not pay for in coins, you paid for in protection, in land, and in the right to live. And that trade is the whole trick of the system. A typical villain held a verget, a block of land of about 30 acres, which was usually just enough to feed his own household and still leave him the time and the strength to owe you his labor. And the peasant side of the deal was just as tight. His 30 acres had to feed his household through the year, pay his own church fees, and still produce the rent and the labor you demanded. A bad season hit him first, and a hungry peasant was a peasant who could not work your fields, which is why the manorial economy, for all its harshness, tried to keep its workers fed. A starving village was a bankrupt manor. In the fields, everything is arranged in long strips. Because the manor uses the open field system, the plowable land is divided into great open fields. Each field is split into narrow strips, and those strips are handed out among the villagers. So one man holds a strip here, another holds one right next to it, and the strips of your own domain are scattered through the same fields. It looks chaotic, but it has a logic. It spreads the good and the bad soil evenly, forces everyone to cooperate on the shared plowing, and keeps the whole village pulling together on the same schedule. And the rotation is built into the land. In a classic three-field system, one field grows a winter crop like wheat, one grows a spring crop like oats or barley, and the third lies fallow, resting. Every year the fields rotate, so the soil is never exhausted, and the community never misses a harvest. Now here is the economic point. Your wealth depends entirely on how much of this unpaid labor you can command, and how much of their produce your peasants owe you. So a good lord, and a smart one, does not squeeze his peasants to the bone, because a sick, starving, or resentful village grows nothing. The manor is a fragile balance, and the lord who pushed too hard often found his fields went unpluffed and his profits vanished. The cleverest lords understood that their peasants were not a cost to be crushed, but an asset to be protected. Let us zoom in on the small machinery of the manor, because medieval wealth was built out of 1,000 tiny transactions, and the first piece of that machinery is the court. Every manor holds a court, usually a few times a year, and it does more than punish. It records who owns which strip, it settles arguments over straying animals and broken fences, it enforces the village rules, and it collects fines. And every fine is a small transfer of coins from a peasant's purse into yours. The court is also where you formalize the little fees that make lordship profitable. You take a small payment when a tenancy changes hands, and you collect a fee when a peasant passes his holding to his heir. None of this is charity. It is the legal plumbing of the whole system. Then there is the mill, and the mill is worth stopping on, because it is the perfect example of a medieval monopoly. You own the only mill for miles. The custom says your peasants must grind their grain there, and nowhere else. And you take a cut of everything they grind. Building a mill in the first place was no small matter. A watermill was one of the most expensive machines of the medieval world. Its gears, its millstones, and its housing could cost more than a year of your income, which is exactly why the lord, and only the lord, could afford to build one, and why his monopoly was so hard to challenge. This is brilliant economics from your point of view, because the peasants do the farming, the grain is theirs, and yet every single sack that passes through your mill drops a small coin or a handful of grain into your pocket. The same logic applies to your oven and your press. Nothing of value moves in the village without flowing through your hands at least once. And finally, there is the market. If you hold the right to a weekly market, you become the center of the local economy. Farmers bring their surplus, townspeople come by, and every sale pays you a toll. And the market did not just serve your village, it connected you to the wider world. A cart from your manor could carry wool to a town. That town could trade it across the sea, and the coins that came back were the threads tying your little estate to the whole of medieval Europe. The manor was never truly isolated. It was a knot in a much larger net of trade. The market is where the manor's grain and wool turn into actual coins, and coins are the thing you always need more of, because rent in kind fills your barn, but cannot pay your debts. So here is the subtle truth of the manorial economy. The lord who only collected grain and labor was rich in storage, but poor in cash, while the lord who actively worked his court, his mill, and his market, and turned everything into coins, was the one who could actually pay his bills, and pay his own lord, and keep his estate alive. Now we come to the most important business decision a medieval lord ever faced. And It is the one that quietly reshaped the whole economy. The question is this: should you farm your domain with your own workers, or should you tear it up and rent the land out to tenants for cash? In the early Middle Ages, the answer was simple. You farmed it yourself, using the unpaid labor of your peasants. And that worked as long as labor was plentiful and cheap. But the system had a hidden weakness. Your income depended on your harvest, and your harvest depended on the weather, on the health of your workers, and on 100 things you could not control. One bad year and your profit vanished. 2 bad years and you were borrowing money. Meanwhile, the world was changing, towns were growing, trade was spreading, and more people wanted to pay in coins instead of labor. So a clever lord in the 13th and 14th centuries started doing something new. He stopped managing every field and instead rented his land out to tenants. The tenants took all the risk of a bad harvest, and the lord collected a fixed rent in cash every year, no matter what happened. By the late 13th century, this process, which historians call commutation, was well underway. The peasant who once owed days of work now owed a rent, and it was a good deal for both sides in good times. The lord got reliable money, and the peasant got control of his own time, but it also quietly dissolved the old bond between the two. From lord and worker, they became landlord and tenant. And that is a relationship the modern world still runs on. So the lord traded the uncertainty of the farm for the reliability of a fixed sum of coins in autumn. The logic is exactly the same as a modern landlord collecting rent. But here's the trap. This trade also froze his income. If the rent was set at £10 in 1240, it was still £10 in 1340, even if everything around it had doubled in price. And that is the snare that would eventually strangle the old knightly class, because in an economy where prices rise but your rent does not, you get poorer every single year without lifting a finger. And then the 1340s arrived and changed everything. Europe was hit by a catastrophe so total that it is hard to describe without leaning on grim details. So we will keep it strictly economic. In the space of a few years, a huge share of the workforce simply disappeared. The fields stood half empty, the villages half silent, and the labor that had been cheap and plentiful for centuries suddenly became scarce and precious. The economic consequences were immediate and dramatic. Wages shot up. Peasants who had once worked for a penny or two a day found their time was now worth far more, because there were simply not enough hands to do the work. Estimates from the period suggest the daily wage of a common laborer roughly doubled in the space of a generation, and landlords who wanted their harvest brought in had no choice but to pay it. In 1351, the English crown answered with the Statute of Laborers, which tried to freeze wages and force workers back to the fields at the old rates. But you cannot legislate away a shortage of hands, and the law mostly failed. And here's the part that hurts the lords. The knight who had locked his rents in cash watched his income stay frozen while his costs, his wages, his prices, everything climbed. The balance of power that had held for 300 years flipped in a single lifetime. Peasants who had owed labor services found they could refuse them, and could negotiate, and could simply leave and go work for a kinderlord down the road. The peasant who had once been tied to the manor could now bargain. And the word bargain is the key, because bargaining requires choice, and choice was exactly what the old system had been designed to prevent. The old system of unpaid labor collapsed because there was no one left to force, and the lords who had relied on it were suddenly on the wrong side of history. The manor did not disappear, but it mutated. Domains shrank, money rent spread, and the free peasant paying a cash rent became the new normal. Historians still argue about exactly how much the ordinary peasant gained in the century that followed. Some paint it as a golden age for the working rural family. Others point out that the lords and the crown fought back with new taxes and new rules. So we will say the honest thing, the details are debated, but the direction is not. The old manorial economy, built on unpaid labor and fixed rents, was broken, and the new one, built on wages and cash, was rising. And in that shift, the knight, the symbol of the whole medieval world, was the big loser. So what does all of this actually mean? Why should a modern viewer care about a few damp fields and a lord worried about his mill? Because the manor is the seed of the economy we still live in. Look at the parts, and you will recognize them. The landlord who rents out land and collects rent, the owner of infrastructure who takes a cut from everyone who uses it, the judge who turns rules into fees, the producer who sells surplus at a market. Every one of these is a role we still see today. The manor is where the modern ideas of property, of rent, of monopoly, and of the market first hardened into a working system. And it is also where we learn a lesson that has not aged a single day. Owning a lot is not the same as being rich. The knight owned a manor, a village, horses, and armor worth a fortune, and yet he was chronically short of cash. Squeezed from above by his lord and the crown, squeezed from below by rising costs, and squeezed from every side by the very lifestyle his rank demanded. Meanwhile, the peasants who owned almost nothing sometimes ended up with more freedom and more money than the man who owned it all. The estate was not a treasure. It was a responsibility, a machine that had to be fed, maintained, and managed, or it would quietly eat its owner alive. And that is the real story of the knightly manor. It is not a fantasy of castles and glory. It is the medieval equivalent of a family business, handed down, fought over, mismanaged, and ultimately reshaped by markets it could not control. And there's one more thing worth noticing. None of this happened in a single dramatic moment. The shift from the old manor to the modern economy took centuries, and ordinary people made it happen one field, one rent, and one wage at a time. History is rarely a single thunderclap. It is 1,000 small decisions that add up to a world, and the manor is a perfect place to watch that happen. So the next time you see a drawing of a knight in shining armor, remember the man behind the helmet, sitting at a wooden table, worrying about the price of grain, the state of his mill, and the wages of the men who would no longer work for free. That is the true face of the medieval economy. And it is a face we have been looking at ever since. If you made it this far, you now know more about the real economics of a medieval manor than most people who ever lived on one. And honestly, that is a superpower. If you enjoyed this little trip into the ledger, drop a comment telling me which medieval estate you want to visit, or which topic we should break down next, like the finances of a medieval town or the economy of a monastery. And if you want more history told this way, with the numbers and the nonsense stripped out, hit subscribe, because from here we're going to keep opening the books on the past, one honest balance sheet at a time. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.